People are eating more fish a day than most Americans eat in a month.
Wow.
And you're not finding toxicity issues. They assume that the women that ate the most seafood and had the highest blood mercury levels were going to have the kids with the most developmental problems. They found it was just the opposite.
When the Greenland Eskimo moves to Canada, eastern Canada, and starts eating the Canadian diet, they have the same heart disease incidence as their Canadian neighbors. They're eating a unique kind of fat that defends them against these concepts of heart disease.
And Harvard School of Public Health, when they busted the trans fatty acids in the 90s, they basically said they double risk of heart attack, they increase risk of stroke, they increase risk of cancer, they're bad for diabetics, they kill at least 30,000 Americans every year, and basically we need to get them out of our diet.
Well, welcome to episode 7 of The Real Skinny on Fat, the truth about weight loss. I'm Montel Williams.
And I'm Naomi Whittle.
And I'm so excited to bring you the guest that we have for you today. Again, keeping in mind that a lot of people don't know a lot about omega-3s, Randy Hartnell. What's his research in?
It's in fishing. He has been a fisherman for his entire career, and what he knows from his experience with fish every day is something that I wanted everyone to hear.
Oh my goodness, and take a look at this.
My name is Randy Hartnell. I'm president and founder of Vital Choice Wild Seafood and Organics, or vitalchoice.com. We provide wild-caught, sustainable seafood to our customers across the United States. Prior to that, I'd been a commercial fisherman in Alaska. I was going to school. My father was a port engineer up in Alaska. He got me a summer job on a fishing boat. I basically fell in love with fishing in Alaska. It's just such a great way to make a living. Physical, primal, it's sort of the last of the hunter and gatherer occupations. So rather than go to law school, I ended up buying a boat and starting my own business. I eventually bought 2 or 3 other boats and expanded into other fisheries, and that became a full-time job for more than 20 years. Supported my family on that. Sometimes my little girl and my wife would come up on the boats. It was a good living. In the late 1990s, around 2000, industrial farm salmon was exploding on world markets. All of a sudden, our markets just dried up. At that time, consumers didn't know the difference between one kind of salmon and another, between farmed and wild. Salmon was salmon. They just knew that, wow, I can get salmon 365 days a year now. I think it was in 2001, when I got to the end of the season, and we'd caught a lot of fish, but I couldn't afford to pay the crew or pay my bills. We were about as low as you can get. I actually got to the point of having the phone book open, looking up bankruptcy attorneys. I got a call from a good friend of mine who was going through this same thing, but he had a plan. He was bringing some of his salmon back from Alaska and trying to market them to different grocery stores around the country. And he would load up his big industrial barbecue and haul it down to the Whole Foods store. I take this salmon out, I set up my barbecue, I tell the story of this incredible wild Alaskan salmon and that I caught it versus this pen-reared farm stuff. And people are interested, they respond, they're excited about it. When they realized that the wild salmon was more sustainable, more nutritious, tasted better, that's what they wanted. He said, I've got a tiger by the tail. These people really want this wild salmon, but they can't get it except when I show up, with what I've gotten. And so I ended up going with him on several trips. And at one point, sort of a light bulb went off in my head that people kept asking me, well, where can I get it if it's not available here? I thought, well, I can send you some. And that was sort of the genesis of what has become our company now. I had a fishing boat in San Francisco, and I was going down there in the winter times to fish for herring. I launched my boat over in Sausalito. I was coming across the bay by Alcatraz, and my engine blew up in my boat. And it was like, how much worse can it get? And I had a little AC/DC TV on the boat. And at some point I overheard this program that they had on. It was a fellow hawking a book called The Wrinkle Cure. Doctor's name was Nicholas Perricone. And the wrinkle cure was basically a wild salmon diet. He was advocating eating wild salmon almost every day. And I perked up and I thought, well, that's great, but where are people going to get wild salmon? I've got to get a hold of this guy. We wrote a letter to him just explaining that we were starting a company shipping wild fish directly to our customers' doors, and that our business would make his advice relevant. It was sort of like putting a note in a bottle and throwing it off. And we're sitting on the boat one day, and I've got this old bag phone that was popular at the time, and all of a sudden the phone rings, and it's his publicist. And I'll never forget, she said, Dr. Perricone got your letter and he wants to put you in his next book. And let me tell you, Dr. Perricone can sell more salmon than Julia Roberts. When Dr. Perricone's show airs in different parts of the country, the stores sell out of all their salmon. We'd be interested in working with you. The book was going to be released about 6 months hence. And so we basically had to build our company in 6 months. Dr. Perricone drove just many, many customers to us, and that many of them remain with us today. I'd focused on catching these fish for a long time, but I didn't know what an omega-3 was. When people would ask me questions, I'd get their contact info and I'd say, I'll get back to you on that. Let me check into that. So I would come home and I would start researching. I learned about omega-3s for a variety of reasons. I think there are over 140,000 people that have been involved in omega-3 studies and populations around the world. Every one of them shows benefit. Heart benefits, brain benefits, eye benefits, I mean, pretty much everything you can think of from consuming these types of unique fats that are in seafood. At last I heard the National Academy of Science had identified 60 chronic conditions related to a deficiency of omega-3 fats. The way we're creating food now, we're paying all these consequences. All these little cellular engines in our bodies are failing. We've taken the omega-3 fats out of the diet. We put all these industrial omega-6 fats in, and you've got this rampant imbalance. So I started going to health and nutrition conferences, and, immersing myself in that sort of nutrition education paradigm. So anyway, I'm in New York at this conference, and I've just heard this really dramatic story about this miraculous recovery that this fellow with brain trauma experienced as a result of high-dose fish oil. I come home. Carla and I get a call from our daughter that she's very sick. We call an ambulance. She's in New York, we're here in Washington State. We get an ambulance to her. She's so sick she can hardly get to the door. I'm rushing Carla out to the airport so that she can fly back there and be with her. And when we're pulling into the airport, my phone rings, and it's the nurse in the emergency room. And she says, Mr. Hartnell, this is so-and-so at the emergency room at Roosevelt Hospital in New York. We've got your daughter here. She's got bacterial meningitis, and you need to come right away. She's in critical condition. One of the first things I remember the doctor telling me was that a common result of this disease that she had was amputation. They'd put her in a coma, so she was in a coma for 9 days. And but the second day we were in there, and she was, they were giving her intravenous feeding. I asked the doctor, can you put fish oil in her feeding tube? And he came back in the next morning and he said, I checked with the pharmacist and we will put fish oil in. So Carla and I sat there by her bed for weeks and weeks. When it was time for her to go home after about 3 months, her neurologist that had treated her for the first month asked us to come by so that he could give her a battery of tests and just assess her condition. And so we all sat there, and he asked her questions, memory questions, and questions about drawing things. And when he was done, he just sat back in his chair and he smiled. And he said, neither I nor anybody on my staff has ever seen anybody come back from as far gone as Rachel was. It's 9 years now. She's recovered. And we can never know what role fish oil played. We believe that it made a difference.
Grant Virgin's family knew only a few details about his accident.
They said, Grant's been hit by a car and he's been airlifted to the local hospital. You don't get airlifted to a hospital unless things are really, really serious. They weren't sure exactly what had happened because it was a hit and run and there was no witness to the actual hit. but that he had been left for dead in the street.
Well, I got hit by a car. You don't know why it happened.
They rushed to the hospital to find out if he was still alive.
It was a tough scene when we got there.
The doctor had a really bad look on his face. He had a torn aorta, which kills 90% of the people right on the scene. He had multiple brain bleeds, and he had fractures.
The doctor said, I'm never going to be able to walk. I'm never going to think clearly. I'm not going to be the person of who I am now.
He's not dead yet. Why would you just, as a parent, how could you ever let go, not knowing that you hadn't done every single possible thing? Fortunately, most of my friends are in the health world, and one of the people I've known for years because of being a nutrition is Randy Hartnell. He reached out and he said, okay, what can I send you? What can I do for you? And told me the story of his daughter, and sent me food that I could feed him. There's salmon patties, and if I had to pick the one thing beyond us all being there and loving him, it would be fish oil.
Yeah, we'll do it starting with January.
January, February, March.
Here is Grant, a year after nearly dying, a year after his family was told to let him go.
Truth is, the way that heals the brain actually is fish oil and other nutrients that would help your brain to rebuild.
And Randy was one of the key instrumental people in helping me make that happen.
If we can get that message out there, it just has the potential to improve the lives of millions and millions of people. 14 years, we have grown every single year, and I suspect that that will continue. Really beyond that, we want to help save the species. Once people have this information, they share it. So breakthrough to me is that we can finally get to a tipping point where enough people understand this. Hopefully it's inspiring to other people, because we were so down. It was just so hard. And out of that rose this just beautiful company with a lot of great employees, thousands of fantastic customers and customer stories that we hear, and just I could never have imagined that something so good could have come from something so bad.
Can you start by telling me your name and a little bit about your background?
Yes, my name is Randy Hartnell. I am founder and CEO of Vital Choice Seafood, vitalchoice.com. I spent 20 years as an Alaskan fisherman, and about 15 years ago I sold my boats and started Vital Choice to provide access to people across the U.S., provide access to these great salmon that I was catching up in Alaska.
Incredible. So we know so much, or we've heard so much about omega-3s and all the different ways that we can get them. I want to hear from you as a fisherman who has been doing it for so many years and then continued to work with these fish. What is it about the Alaskan wild salmon that's so incredibly different than the salmon that most of us eat, which is a farm-raised salmon?
Love that question. Well, Alaskan salmon are wild. In fact, they have banned salmon farming in Alaska. So if you buy Alaska salmon, you're only getting wild salmon. About 50 years ago, the state of Alaska established their constitution, and they made a priority that all their salmon fisheries, all of their fisheries, would be managed on a sustainable yield basis. So essentially what that meant is they put scientists in charge of managing the fisheries. And consequently, their fisheries have thrived. They're a model for the world as far as fisheries management. So when you look around the world at declining fisheries, or you see the headlines about declining fisheries, Alaska's the other end of the spectrum. They have some of, just this year, just a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a prediction for the next year's salmon run, and they're predicting one of the biggest runs they've ever had.
What do you mean by run? That's when...
I'm sorry, that's each year
Yes.
the salmon come back. You know, they migrate out into the ocean, take about a 4-year trek, then they come back into the streams in which they were born and spawn, and the cycle begins anew. And so each year the run of salmon comes in, and so the last few years have been just spectacular runs of salmon. Healthy runs, abundant, and the other difference is this is a truly wild fish, or truly wild food, one of the last truly wild, sort of, if you will, naturally organic foods available to us. And salmon in particular is just an amazing nutrient-dense food. There are over 130 species that we know that wild salmon sustains over the course of its life cycle. And so we humans are just one. But whether you're talking about the omega-3 fats or the micronutrients, the vitamin D, it's just hard to find another food that is as healthy, as natural, and as sustainable as wild salmon. Farm salmon is none of those.
Really?
Yeah.
So if I'm eating 6 ounces of farm salmon, that's this like light pinkish color, versus Alaskan salmon, there's a complete distinction between the nutrient profiles
Yes.
between the two. If I eat a piece of Alaskan salmon, and I was just in Alaska, and it was the most incredible experience because I actually went into the waters where the salmon were spawning and got to really have that experience, and it was truly a remarkable thing. And then to be able to eat that salmon fresh, it was so delicious. And I always eat, whenever I can, I'll always be eating a wild caught because I know that there is a big difference, but I don't know the exact difference. So can you sort of lay out for us just some of the key differences so when we're making choices, we understand the choices we're making?
Sure. So on a nutritional, from a nutritional standpoint, like us, salmon are what they eat. One of the biggest differences nutritionally is that farm salmon are not fed a natural diet.
Right.
The whole objective of the farm salmon industry is to get the cost as low as possible. And the cheapest thing you can feed a salmon or a cow or a pig or any other type of livestock is corn, soy, grains,
Right.
especially in this country, where we subsidize the grain. So consequently, farm salmon is fed a lot of grain, which affects the fat profile of the fish, which influences the taste. If we're talking about omega-3s,
Right.
you have a much higher omega-6 level in farm salmon. And again, I'm generalizing here. There may be individual examples where that's not necessarily the case, but generally the mass-produced farm salmon is going to have much higher levels of omega-6s. And then there's the antibiotic issue and the artificial coloring
Right.
and veterinarian drugs. So that's on the nutritional side. They're just nowhere near a wild salmon.
I've also heard with the farm raised from the CEO of Bon Appetit Management, Fidel, that there's even a real concern around the cleanliness and what they're eating and what's covering their bodies, and it really took me to the point where I never wanted to eat farm raised.
Well, it's again, there are maybe exceptions, but in general, it's like feedlot cattle or any other industrial livestock that we're raising. Farm salmon are given more antibiotics per pound than any other livestock.
Really?
And that is because, the water is a medium that transmits infection and disease, and so they need to be heavily medicated. So that's on the nutritional side. What I'm really passionate about, in addition to that, is the environmental impacts of farm salmon. If you look around the world to places where they've established farm salmon pens, farm salmon ranches, if you will, where there was a native wild population, those are basically extinct. So if you go to Norway, where salmon farming was really started, or you go to Scotland or Ireland, wherever they placed the salmon farms, it's displaced the wild salmon. It's the disease, the parasites, the things that that it exposes the wild populations to.
So when we eat Scottish salmon, it could be farm raised.
It's always farm raised.
Yes. It's tricky. It's so tricky
Oh,
to
it's
try to
interesting.
understand these different pieces.
And as
for us.
consumers become more educated,
Right.
And I've seen a huge transformation since we started this 15 years ago.
15 years ago.
It used to be, what's the difference between wild and farm? And now it's, that's not farmed, is it? And so to get around that or to deal with that, a lot of the restaurants or stores, whatever, they get pretty tricky about how they describe the fish.
Right. It's all marketing at the end of the
And
day. Right?
there's a tremendous amount of fraud out there. If they think they can get away with it, they'll just say it's wild when it's not. And there have been credible studies done just about every year, and they always find 50, 60, 70% of the salmon in markets that's labeled wild is actually farmed.
Oh, really? In market?
And restaurants too. This happens to me all the time. It's happened to me 3 times in the last year where I will ask specifically, is this wild salmon? And if they're not sure, a lot of times they'll disappear into the kitchen and then come back and say,
Yes.
yes, but it's oftentimes not.
And I bet you, after 20 years of being a fisherman and 15 years of bringing wild Alaskan salmon into the market, you're probably the person that can detect it.
Well, and it's pretty easy to detect it. And also you can just tell by the way if it's true wild salmon, that's a premium product. They paid top dollar for that.
Everyone
and they made a
knows.
decision to go get that product. And so the wait staff will know. If they don't know, that's your first sign that it is farm salmon.
So let's talk about the difference between a farm salmon and an Alaskan wild caught salmon and the amount of fish oil that we get from both of those.
Well, it depends on what type. There are 5 species of wild salmon in Alaska. Generally, the oil content corresponds to where in the river that fish has evolved to spawn. So, for instance, king salmon, they're the big ones.
Yes.
They tend to spawn the furthest up the river. They have to swim a long ways. And once these fish come back from the ocean and they enter back into the river, there generally is not much food in the river. So they have to be packing the calories that they need to get to the spawning grounds. So if a king salmon has to swim 1,000 miles with no food, he's evolved to have a lot of fat, a lot of oil. And so king salmon generally have the highest levels of omega-3s and oils. And then within the same species, it can vary by river. So if you have a king salmon that's coming back to a river where he's only got to swim for a couple days to get to the spawning grounds, he's going to have much lower fat than, say, a Yukon River king salmon that has to swim weeks.
For a salmon that has to swim 1,000 miles, which is a mind-blowing thought, because those rivers, there are points where they're so shallow. I can't even imagine how they move over the rocks in some of the sections. 1,000 miles, how long does it take that salmon?
They're spectacular creatures.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just unbelievable athletes.
Huh.
And so you could take a sockeye salmon, which is
Right.
one of our signature products
Yes.
and very popular. There are a lot of sockeye that come out of Bristol Bay, Alaska, and those are incredible, nutritious, sustainable fish. But they swim, their rivers are relatively short, and so they don't have super high fat levels versus a sockeye that maybe has to swim up the Fraser River in British Columbia or, like I said, thousands, sometimes more than 1,000 miles. So you can have a wild Alaskan salmon from one part of the state that may have twice as much oil as a wild Alaska salmon from another part, and fat is flavor.
Oh, yes, it is.
And the interesting thing about when I was a fisherman, I fished in the area where they had the shorter rivers. I didn't know any of this then. I didn't even know what an omega-3 was. I just knew that my sockeye were worth half as much as the sockeye that were being caught in another part of the state. And I never really fully understood that, but it was because the Japanese, they understood it. They were willing to pay top dollar, not for the salmon, but for the oil, really is what they're...
the liquid gold.
Because it's so, primarily the flavor, I think, and then the health aspects of it as well.
So let's take the dream Alaskan king salmon that's just started the journey of 1,000 miles to go to its spawning area, and we were to eat right here, let's say 6 ounces each of us of that. Roughly, what do you think the amount of oil would be that we would be getting?
Probably anywhere from 3 to 5 grams of, that's a lot of fish oil pills.
That's a lot of fish oil pills. So 3 to 5 grams of oil in roughly in a 6 ounce piece
But
of fish.
Naomi, people always ask me, which one has the most
Yeah.
fat? Which one has the most omega-3s? And
Sure.
they're all fantastic.
Oh, yes.
If you eat any piece of wild salmon, you're getting a couple days worth of omega-3s, if not more.
So great to think about it because it really speaks to food being our medicine. And like in my family, my children love salmon and they've loved it always. And so a lot of times they'll start their morning with salmon, and that's just the way their bodies like to be nourished. And so teaching them the difference between the different
Well, you
types of
started them
salmon.
out right. If you
We get a
introduce
taste for
the
it.
natives in Alaska, I've talked to natives in Alaska, the very first food that they give their infants at about 7 or 8 months is salmon roe.
Wow.
And so I've told that story quite a few times, and we have a lot of customers that will do that, or even our employees when they have children will
Yes.
start their kids off on
Salmon
And I
roe.
think that establishes an appeal.
It definitely does. My children love salmon roe. They eat it all the time, and they get it by the spoonful, right? So if we go to a restaurant, a sushi restaurant, they'll get their salmon roe, and they eat a big spoonful of it, and it's a treat because they pop in your mouth, and it's
That's
so
fantastic.
flavorful.
And it's just one of the healthiest foods, just pure, natural fat.
It's really exciting. When I was recently in Alaska, I spoke to a lot of the Inuits about what they like to eat and where they got their nourishment from. And their relationship to the ocean, what they told me was that the ocean is not a place to play, but really it's a place of work and where they get nourishment from. And so they respect the ocean at a very high level. And that during the cold winter months, and obviously it's cold so much of the year in different parts of Alaska, they get their energy not from a cup of coffee, like we would imagine, but really from fatty fish. So if it's the blubber of the seal or organ meat or whatever it is. When you were a fisherman there, did you eat some of these different parts of the fish? And
That's a great question. I know so much more about fish and omega-3s now than I did when I was a fisherman.
Yes.
I've been asked so many questions and done the research, but what's amazing about salmon, wild salmon and seafood is it's full of these long-chain fats, right?
Yeah.
Which are the most bioactive molecules that we know of. The EPA and the DHA are just incredibly bioactive molecules. And I can't think of another more energetic food than a wild salmon or any types of seafood that you get up there that are full of these energetic molecules.
so what happens when we think about tuna? So tuna, so many of us are told not to eat it because of the high heavy metal content that it has. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I have a few things to say about that. It's not really fair or accurate to paint all tuna with the broad brush of high in mercury, avoid, not worth eating.
How come?
Well, you could have a little skipjack tuna that's 2 years old that has very little mercury in it. And you could have a 800-pound bluefin that's been out there swimming around bioaccumulating mercury for decades. And so to say that those are the same, or that the nutritional benefits of one is the same as the other, it's just not accurate. But how, it's our nature to generalize. And so I spent a lot of time explaining that difference to people. And really, it's all about the benefits versus the risks. And the bottom line, in my opinion, based on a lot of reading and research and studies, and some of the most credible scientific studies, the results of those show that the benefits of eating fish, whether it's tuna or, there are trace levels of mercury in anything that comes out of the ocean.
Right.
And we know that life evolved in the ocean. We evolved amid a background of trace levels of mercury, because most of the methylmercury comes from the land, from erosion. They have found Inuit graves, taken hair samples from bodies, 10,000-year-old bodies, and found mercury in them. So it's not like mercury hasn't been there forever. And I think humans have evolved a mechanism to deal with trace levels of it. Now, when you eat a giant tuna or swordfish or shark or a marine mammal or something like that, you're getting very high, relatively high levels of mercury. So it's best to stay away from that. But if you're eating a small tuna or a sardine, mackerel, wild salmon, short-lived fish, generally the benefits, all those good fats, all the micronutrients that you're getting outweigh the risk of trace levels of mercury.
And with these small tuna, what is the benefit from the fish oil perspective? Are there parts of the tuna that are better than others?
Well, we surprised ourselves. We took some of the loin, the belly cut of the tuna, which you can find in Italy and other countries. It's known as toro or sushi
Yes.
bar. If you go to a sushi
Okay.
bar, the most expensive cut of fish you're going to get is the toro, the belly of the tuna, and that's where the fat is concentrated. And so we sent some in for sampling, for testing, and what we found, and this is also applied to salmon, that the belly cut of that fish is much higher in omega-3 fats than the rest of the fish. And so we actually created a product around that, and it's really remarkable. So you remember I mentioned the king salmon, you might get 3 to 5 grams.
Yes.
If you were to eat a 6-ounce portion of the belly of these little tuna that we're sourcing, it would be like 12 or 14 grams. We have a little 3-ounce can, it's 7 grams, mostly DHA. So we have pediatricians out there that will recommend that moms eat one of those a week.
Yes. And there's so many mothers. I was just speaking to a mother the other day whose son is on the spectrum, and her pediatrician has recommended that she adds high levels of fish oil into his diet. And where and how can she get them? Because it's so challenging. So
I've heard so many stories about that I could talk all day about. Anecdotal stories about how kids have been helped with. One other thing I wanted to say about the methylmercury, and you may be aware of this, but there's the selenium factor. So part of this natural capacity we have to handle methylmercury has to do with selenium. And as it's been explained to me, one of the problems with methylmercury, it has a high binding affinity with selenium in our cells. And so and you need selenium in every one of our cells for it to function properly. So if you're getting high doses of mercury, it's binding with the selenium in your cells and causing problems. You have toxicity. The thing about seafood, tuna, wild salmon, they are super high. They're some of the best sources of selenium that you're going to find.
Nature is perfect.
According to science, Dr. Nick Ralston is sort of a leading scientist in this area. He said basically you're getting the anecdote with the fish. And that's why you can go around the world and look at fish-consuming populations like Japan or the ocean nations. These people are eating more fish a day than most Americans eat in a month.
Wow.
And you're not finding toxicity issues. And I mean, there have been very credible, long-term, large, elegant studies. One is in the Seychelles Islands. It's been going on for, I think, close to 30 years now. Another one is 14,000 women and their offspring in the UK. You know, when they set out, they figured that they assumed that the women that ate the most seafood and had the highest blood mercury levels were going to have the kids with the most developmental problems. When they got done, in both cases, they found it was just the opposite. It was the moms who were eating the least amount of seafood that had the kids with the highest levels of developmental problems.
Wow.
And so the conclusion, and this was published in The Lancet, was that advice to women to limit your seafood consumption during pregnancy was actually causing the harm it was intended to prevent.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
The deficit of these healthy fats in the maternal diet was actually causing a decrease in IQ level.
Wow.
So the mercury, the trace levels of mercury, they calculated might decrease the child's IQ level by 0.1 or something like that, but the absence of these fats could decrease the child's IQ by 5 points. So the conclusion was that the benefits just vastly outweigh the risks. But you know, as Peter Diamandis talks about, we're all walking around with these Stone Age brains, and we're 10 times more receptive to bad news, and we don't hear the good news. People won't hear this message. They'll just hear that seafood has got mercury in it, so I'm not eating it.
Well, they're going to hear it today.
Good, that's great. Well, that's
because
it's so important.
You've been really educating on it for these 15 years, and when you decided to start to bring this wild Alaskan salmon into the marketplace, what was the impetus? What drove you to do that initially?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention. I couldn't make a living fishing anymore. It was devastating, really, to myself and other people in the industry. We had this incredible, wonderful food. It was sustainable, but farm salmon had basically taken over our markets. And so I initially went out trying to educate people, myself and some friends, just educate people about the differences between wild and farm salmon, why you should choose wild, be willing to pay a little more for wild. And it was really remarkable when I shared that message with people. They responded, and they didn't want farm salmon anymore. They wanted wild. But at that point, every grocery store in America, every restaurant in America, for the most part, had defaulted to these farm salmon.
Sure.
Because they're cheap, they're plentiful, they're a profit pipeline. Even Whole Foods, it positions itself as, you know, sustainable and green and conscientious. They never gave up their farm salmon. Well, I won't get into it, but But it's just so profitable. And so consequently, these people that I was educating that wanted the wild salmon didn't know where to get it. And one day I was talking to this woman, her name was Helen Gaydosh, and she said, Randy, where can I get wild salmon? And I said, I'll send you some.
Aww.
And so I did. And then I learned about other online companies that were sending food through the mail, and the rest is history, so to speak. But it's been very gratifying to be able, even now, this story has got out. More people are demanding wild salmon, so it is far more available than it used to be. The fishermen are making a great living now, and it's not only American consumers that are demanding wild salmon, but Japan is back, China's back, Europe. So wild salmon really has an international market, and consequently the fishermen are making good money, and it's really a great story.
Good. So the cycle is starting to turn, and
So the
everyone is
question I have
benefiting.
is, do I want to go back fishing again? I get asked this a lot. Do you
Oh,
want to go
really?
back fishing again? But I really love, I just really love educating people and then providing access to
Right.
this incredible food.
It's a huge gift that you're giving so many of us, and we're so lucky and
thank you.
grateful to be able to understand even the difference, because living in a society that we do that is based on consumerism and based on capitalism, it's very difficult to understand how to make the right choices.
And one other challenge is, as more people around the world are looking for wild salmon,
Yes.
it drives the price up.
Right.
And as a general rule, Americans do not want to pay very
Right.
much for their food. I mean, all we do is we're seafood snobs, right? Because we know, we bet on that side.
Yes.
We know where the good fish is. And so we go and pay whatever we have to do to get the very best. We put a little margin on it so that we can survive, and then we put it out on the market.
Yeah.
And most Americans, that's outrageous. That's so expensive. Well, that's what it costs. You know, and so consequently, what we're doing more and more of is we're exporting the very best seafood that we have in America. We're exporting a lot of that wild salmon and other really fantastic seafood that comes out of Alaska. And we're importing some of the least sustainable, least nutritious,
Interesting.
you know, the tilapia and the farm shrimp, which is probably one of the least sustainable foods on the planet. And I think it's the #1 seafood consumed in America. So that's another part of our challenge, is to, you know, educate people about the value proposition. If
Right.
you really want real food that's super nutrient dense and nutritious and good for you, you have to be willing to pay a little more.
And if you also look at it as food being our medicine, and if we're getting 3, 4, 5 grams of fish oil, and we're not having to take that from a supplement, again, you need to compare the cost
That's
between a
right.
farm-raised
It's
and
really such
a
an
wild.
incredible value. And I have a story, I think it originally came from a famous marketing guy, Zig Ziglar. And he talks about the $1 million racehorse. He said, if you had a $1 million racehorse, what would you feed it? You would feed it the very best food that you could possibly feed it. You would, you know, you just wouldn't feed it junk. It wouldn't make any sense. We are all $1 million racehorses, and we all deserve to be eating food that's going to sustain us, nurture our health, and wild salmon is one of those foods.
I couldn't agree with you more. Randy, thank you for being an amazing fisherman
thank
and
you.
for educating the world on the differences. It is so important, and my kids thank you too.
Oh, thank you. It's really a deep pleasure and honor to be able to provide such a wonderful food for people.
What an interesting story, really.
Isn't it? And to think that we can get our fish oil from the fish that we eat, just depending on where it comes from and what type.
Absolutely amazing. See, what I really love about what we're doing is that we back all the talk with real, solid scientific research, like Dr. Bland. Now tell us a little bit about him.
Dr. Jeffrey Bland is a PhD and the father of functional medicine. I was so privileged to be able to learn from him all about omega-3s and how they develop and the impact that they can have on our health.
Oh, take a look at this.
So, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, I am so thrilled to be able to speak with you today and learn from you. You have been the leader of the leaders in functional medicine. You created functional medicine for over 35 years. I've heard so much and learned so much in the natural products industry from the work that you've done, from working and building Deshay to really helping us within the industry to understand what nutrition means and where does it come together with medicine. Why did you create functional medicine? What does it mean to you?
Well, thank you. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you about, obviously, a passion that's for 40 years of my life been kind of 24/7 front and center. I had an epiphany in my life that probably is what guides many of us, certain events that occur, and two events that were really monumental in my life that kind of instructed me as to where I wanted to take my background and energy was my wife and I unfortunately lost our second son to a sudden infant death, which was quite a dramatic experience, as you could probably imagine. Yes. He was 4 months old. And that experience really crystallized for me how I wanted to spend my time, that I thought if I could find a way to prevent one series of parents or a child going through this experience, it would be a life well served. So it opened my mind to all sorts of options and opportunities beyond that of my own just kind of disciplinary training in biochemistry and medicine. And so I think I became a seeker through that process of everything's fair game. You should be open to all learnings and all stories. It doesn't mean everything you hear is true, but you should seek from a wide variety of information what might be the truth. And through that, I was guided, I think, through a number of experiences that ultimately led me as a university professor to have a sabbatical with Linus Pauling.
Right.
He and his wife, Eva Helen, were just remarkable guides, beyond just that of their intellect and their really capability of creating new science. Their humanism was just so powerful, having won his second Nobel Prize in Peace and nuclear test disarmament. And it was just such a guide to me, particularly with Eva Helen, who was kind of his social conscience and kept reminding him that a scientist had certain obligations and responsibilities to society.
Which is so amazing. So I just, when I understood that Linus Pauling, one of maybe the only person that's won 2 Nobel Prizes that are completely distinct, right? 2 Nobel Prizes. Right. When I understood that he chose you to be the individual that would direct the nutritional studies within the Linus Pauling Institute to do that, and what was it that you got out of that most unique experience that can really transform so many of our health?
Well, thank you. I don't think I could say specifically what it was for the magic of him choosing me, other than the fact that as I had really targeted trying to develop a relationship with Dr. Pauling, because I was so committed to his work that they were doing beyond that of vitamin C. This is the whole nature of history and all the things that he was involved in developing, the understanding of immunology, anesthetic drugs. I mean, the concept of structure function, which was his platform, plays at so many levels. So you can have structure and function tied to societies, to individuals, to cultures, to ecology, or to molecules.
And what does structure and function mean nutritionally? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, isn't it, that Deshay picked this term up. We have now structure function claims. So what does it really mean? I think I would translate it in a soundbite saying that if you get the structure right, the function will follow. And you can follow that in human relationships. If you get the relationship structure right, the function of a good relationship will follow. If you get a molecule of living, say vitamin C, it in its natural structure, to get in the body correctly, its function will be seen. So it really speaks to the natural order, that there is something about why stuff evolved the way it did, why we are exposed to certain things, why we eat the way we do, why we live the way we do, how our genes respond to our environment are related to how they've evolved this structure-function relationship. And when we don't go with nature, when we're going anti-structure, then our function is affected, and that travels into all diseases.
Do you yourself, having been through the experiences within your own family, the story you told us about your son, when you think about nutrition and you think about medicine, do you use that same approach personally? And can you give me a practical example of structure function?
Yeah, because if you examine how this affects an individual's life, so this in my life comes to pass virtually every day, where you confront something that is a challenge. And I mean, it may be just a discussion with one of your children, right?
Yes.
And you have a conflict, and you start to then say, oh man, I'm so aggravated with that. They're not seeing what I think they should see or do what I think they should do. Then you ask the question, so what's the structure under which we should be examining this particular issue, this conflict? And then when you look at the structural issue, which may be a perspective difference between you and your age and they and their age, or it may be that you didn't know all the information, or they didn't understand you. So there's a structural problem that's kind of inhibited you meeting together to create a solution to get a healthy function, a good outcome. So that would be one in a social context that I've used repetitively through the growth and development, not only of my children, but now even the way my grandkids and I interact. Similarly, the way that I run companies, and I'm kind of a serial entrepreneur. Since I left being a university professor, I've probably been involved in the startup and running of maybe 15 different companies. And I've tried to use that management construct in the way that I deal with people. If there's a conflict in the way that we're doing business or how we're interacting with a partner or a customer, then what's the structural blockade? Similarly, if we go to nutrition and we start to say, you start looking at the ways that you want to improve human health, and you want to induce in that individual a characteristic that will lead them to 100 years of healthy living, then are we providing to that individual structurally the things that are needed based upon their genetic template, their book of life, those 23 chapters that code for who they are in their genome, half of which has been given to their biological mother, the other their biological father, that doesn't tell them who they are, it tells them who they might be. Are we then giving that structure the right information for which their function will be 100 years of healthy living? So this plays out, I think, as a concept that you can use in many different theaters.
What do you think we're missing in that structure function, and why in our society are we suffering so much from so many diseases? And you know, I'm very interested in the macronutrients and the micronutrients and how they influence our health, and why we're struggling so much with weight, for example, energy, well-being.
Well, I think that's a great example specifically of this structure function concept. So let's look at the macronutrients. So we have protein and we have fat and we have carbohydrate. And we all think we know what they are. We know that protein and carbohydrate, we've said, has 4 calories per gram. Fat has 9 calories per gram. So it seems like it's just a simple example of calorie counting, and no matter what the carbohydrate, fat, or protein is, as long as it's a member of that family, we know what it's all about.
Right.
Well, that concept is totally fallacious. It's wrong, because each one of those, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, has a different structure within the family. So if you talk about, is there a difference between vegetable protein and animal protein? The answer is absolutely yes. Even though they both are 4 calories per gram, the personality those have in the way they affect the function of the body is very, very different. And so if you start saying, well, why are they different? Well, it turns out that the amino acid composition of the animal proteins are different than the amino acid composition of the vegetable proteins. Now, each of those amino acids that make up those proteins, when they're broken down by digestion and come into the body, have their own unique principles. So you're sending different information to the body with vegetable protein than you're sending with animal protein. Now, in some cases, the information you're sending from animal protein might be, in a certain case, exactly what you want to get the function. In other cases, maybe it's vegetable protein. Those amino acids are sending a different set of signals as what you want for your function. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that we can apply that same to fats and carbohydrates. There's a huge difference between carbohydrates, which are sugar, 4 calories per gram, versus calories that come from the carbohydrates of starch. And then there are differences of the type of starch. There are branch-chain starches and there are straight-chain starches, amylopectins and amylose. Those have different effects on the body. So when we just start aggregating things saying, oh, it's all about protein, carbohydrate, and fat, it's like, no, we need to know the players, because there's more difference in the way the body's function changes based on the difference of the players of each of those families than there is the difference among the families.
Wow.
You can take this and apply it, and there's a huge amount of nutritional research upon which government recommendations have been made that people think on the back of cereal boxes, but they were based on flawed science. They were based on the fact that we aggregated protein, carbohydrate, and fat in these studies, and no one even knew what the composition of them was.
Wow.
They just knew they were carbohydrate or protein or fat.
Right.
And then we make nutrition decisions that affect the lives of many people in which we're genetically different one from the other, and we wonder why we have problems.
So when you talk about fats, and you were talking about omega-3s, 6s, and 9s, you told me a great story, and it inspired me so much that I ended up flying to Alaska, to Dutch Harbor, and I want you to tell the story of omega-3, of a special form of omega-3. So can you tell us the original story and sort of take us through the differences in omega-3s?
So what happened to me in this whole area is quite interesting, because in 1980, I actually was the first guy in America to be asked to promote omega-3 fatty acids as a new opportunity. Now, if you think of where we were in 1980, we were in the midst of the Pritikin Revolution, which where fats were bad and dangerous. And so everybody was cutting out fats, and we were saying, no, that's not good for human health. And so for someone to come on and then say, we have research that's been done by Bang and Dyerberg from the Karolinska and from Denmark that has showing that the Greenland Eskimos who eat these diets that are 80% of the calories coming from fats have lower incidence of all sorts of diseases, and therefore maybe the right kind of fat.
Wait, did you say 80% of their calories coming from fats?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
80%.
That's like the ketogenic diet,
yes,
for sure. Okay, so all of them were eating essentially the ketogenic diet.
Yes, that's right.
Wow.
And so it was from blubber and seals and things that were basically marine fats. And so when I learned of this, I thought, well, is this really true? I actually picked this up at a meeting I was in England in the late 70s. And then from that, a company called R.P. Shearer was the first company then to concentrate these omega-3 fats that they were identifying in the Greenland Eskimo diet as being beneficial. And they produced the first product called Max-EPA. And then I was the person in America that was to talk this story. And it was a really interesting exercise, because I recognized that the dominant concept then was fat is bad. So what, you're talking about good fats? Come on, these don't really exist.
And how did people respond to that? Because I'm thinking we're 2017 now, and there's still such a belief that fats are bad. And yet we've got all of this science, all of this history showing us that the right types of fats are life-giving and so therapeutic, and you were bringing this information, sort of trailblazing it truly in the 80s.
Yes, and there was a lot of pushback, and
Right.
and I think when I went on to media at that point, it was more of as a contrarian, and the people wanted to use me as a stalking horse to talk about how foolish this is. There had been a study just done at Harvard and at Mass General that had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was the whole reason that I felt somewhat comfortable, showing that these omega-3s could be scientifically demonstrated in humans to influence the production of inflammatory mediators. They reduced inflammation. And the New England Journal is arguably one of the top medical journals in the world. And so I thought, well, I've got this bit of information that I can talk about mechanistically that kind of differentiates from just anecdote and testimony to science.
And how much omega-3 was that was discussed in this
Yeah,
study?
so this was 6 grams a day, which was at that point a lower potency than some of the products today. So it was something like about 2 grams of EPA and DHA equivalent. And then another person at New York University picked this up, and he was a rheumatologist, and he did some studies in arthritis and published that as well. So we had a little bit of a wind at our back as it relates to some of the science. But still, you're overcoming a tremendous bias of the time, which is even good science sometimes doesn't win through until you get to a kind of a conceptual aha. Boating is our hobby, our family hobby, and we do quite a bit of cruising up into Alaska from Seattle, which is where it is really beautiful. So on one of these trips, I happened to run into, we were docked in Sitka, Alaska, and a fishing boat came in, a very nice-looking fishing boat, and I got talking to the skipper and got interested, and it turned out that it was a Seattle-based fishing company called Bering Select and Clipper Seafoods, and so he said, well, I'd introduce you to our owner because, you're asking a lot of questions that might be he could answer because
What kind of questions were you asking?
Well, about the various equipment they were using in the boat, the technology, because this was a very interesting boat. It was designed uniquely to catch fish one at a time on a hook and line. So they would, it wasn't any bycatch, it wasn't any nets, it wasn't like trolling. And the fish would come in live into the boat, and they'd be taken off the hook and processed on board, and then the fish would be flash frozen at -20 within 20 minutes after being caught, which was very unusual.
Does that happen? I don't know that much about fishing and boating. Is this something that usually happens with the fish that we eat?
No, it doesn't. This is unusual. That most commonly, both in the North Sea, like Iceland and Norway and up in that area, and in Alaska, the more common kind of way the fish are caught is they're either caught by nets or they can even be caught by line. But then they're thrown down into the hold of the ship with ice, hopefully, and then they're accumulated over a period of days while they're fishing in the hold of the ship until they're brought to a processing plant. So they've been sitting there, even if they've been kept cold, undergoing some degree of degradation as a consequence.
So they become somewhat rancid over that time. When I think about frozen vegetables, so I know that we can go to the grocery store and we can buy our fresh, or we can buy these frozen vegetables.
Yep.
And I've heard, and maybe you can tell us more, that the frozen actually many times, because they're frozen immediately, can have a more nutrient-dense profile.
That is correct, and that's a really good explanation for what this fishing group was doing. By the way, the owner of this fishing company is kind of unique because he had an engineering degree from the University of Michigan, which is not a normal thing for a fishing captain, but he constructed this concept and actually went through with NOAA and the marine fisheries to get a selected MSC marine certified fishery that was a controlled stewardship fishery that actually was sustainable. So he had this whole vision of how to manage that fishery and to produce the quality of the product that they were looking for. So when he was explaining this process to me, I thought, wow, that's exciting. He says, yeah, and because this is a controlled fishery, we really can't grow our business because we only can catch so much fish.
Right.
And I said, well, that's great. And he said, well, it's great, but for an entrepreneur, I wish we had an expanding market. And he said, so we try to sell every portion of our fish because we think this is a premium fish. So we have some markets that like the fins and some markets that like the heads and different Asian markets.
Yes.
But he says there's one part of the fish that we can't sell and we have to grind up and throw back. That was the fish guts.
Oh.
So then I asked him, I said, well, I know it sounds a little bit strange, but what's in your fish guts? And he said, well, what do you mean what's in? I mean, like what chemicals are in it? He says, I'm a fisherman. I'm not like a chemist. What do you mean? I said, well, why don't you send me some of this frozen material that you're now throwing away, and send it frozen to our lab, and we'll do an analysis. So he said, okay. So arriving at our office one day was this truck that backed up and had 50 pounds of frozen fish stuff, right? That we took it and we analyzed it. We found out there was some extraordinarily biologically active material that was very valuable in there. And we
So what are the actual fish guts?
So what we found was very high levels of certain unusual fatty acids that have health benefits.
So omega-3s?
Omega-3s,
Okay.
phospholipids, sphingolomyelin, sphingosphene, a whole variety of different bioactive components that are good for brains and immune systems. And so along with vitamin A and D and all the natural conjugates, because in nature, vitamin A is several different variables and vitamin D is several different variables. So we found a rich portfolio of these nutrients that can only be in there if you capture those fish and immediately put them in a frozen situation, because they would degrade pretty quickly if they just sat around. I said to him, this is an interesting composition, and have you ever thought that maybe we could develop a commercializing process that would retain these materials and it would produce an oil that really had never been seen before, unless you were eating the fish itself from the raw state.
Wow.
And so we went about, and this was kind of an engineering project, to see if we could develop a technology to take that flash frozen now fish guts that were being put on the ship, and we consider this the most valuable fish material ever produced, and we could then retain their value through the processing. So we developed an engineering process that allowed us to actually preserve the integrity. It's on the Aleutian Island chain. It's the most high volume fish producing port in the world.
And I went there and I was amazed.
Isn't
I
that
had no
something?
idea that this port would produce that kind of
$1 billion pounds a year of fish products.
Seriously. Wow.
And so you have fishing fleets from all sorts of nations that
Right.
kind of go through there. And it's a very, as you saw, it's a very unusual place. It's actually quite a beautiful place, volcanic.
So pristine,
Yes.
so beautiful. We went out on the boats and the wildlife, from the eagles to
Oh,
the
fantastic.
whales, everything that we could imagine was there.
You know, if you think of what nourishes the oceans,
Right.
it's the primary productivity of the phytoplankton that then gets consumed by the zooplankton. And that area has the richest phytoplankton and zooplankton blooms because of the nature of the long days and the currents and the nutrients that are there. Being a volcanic island chain, you've got all this nutrition that comes from the mineral salts. So it's a very remarkable fishery, and then it's very highly regulated. And you know, the state of Alaska doesn't allow any fish farming, so
Right.
it's all wild caught. So we ended up producing what used to be considered a waste product that I considered to be extraordinarily valuable. And then our plant that we developed was the first pharmaceutical grade plant. You went there.
I went to the pharmaceutical grade plant. To be able to understand that you're freezing these fish, their guts, right there after they've been line caught, and then they're transported so easily and effectively to a plant that's in Dutch Harbor. Dutch Harbor is so tiny, there's really nothing else there.
Exactly.
So tell me a little bit about really what is in this omega-3 Alaskan oil that's so remarkable that you discovered in your labs.
Well, you know, it's kind of obviously, not maybe even more than a kind of, I guess I can say I'm a biochemist geek. So when we got the portfolio of analysis of what was in the oil, I thought, oh my word, you know, I don't think this looks like any other of the oils that we have analyzed over the last 20 years. There's some unique composition in this that we need to understand that was put in there by the animal for its function. I mean, again, it comes back to this concept, why do we have certain things in our body? Their structure is related to some function. They don't just come along for the ride for no reason. So when we started to look at what was in there, we found out that there was obviously this rich array of omega-3 fatty acids, but we also found that there was a unique family of the vitamin A and D, what we call conjugars, the array of those derivatives that relate to the natural vitamin A and D signature. And then as we looked deeper, we found that there were these little peaks in our chemical tracing that caused us to interrogate deeper. And they turned out to be the so-called specialized pro-resolving mediators, or sometimes abbreviated SPMs.
What does that mean?
Yeah,
SPMs?
SPMs,
Okay.
right.
I like the abbreviation. We'll start with that. But what is that?
Well, it turns out that a number of years ago, a well-known investigator at Harvard discovered in omega-3 oils and in other biological oil materials that there were these trace materials that had some impact on biology that had never been discovered before, that he named specialized pro-resolving mediators. And the reason that they were named, this is Dr. Sirhan at Harvard, why they were named SPMs was that they seem to have an effect on resolving inflammation.
Oh, incredible.
So this story of inflammation is an interesting story. We often hear of anti-inflammatories, that we want to block inflammation. But actually, blocking inflammation has some potential adverse effects because inflammation is our body's protection against infection or against injury. Mm-hmm. So we have an effective, important role that inflammation plays in getting rid of debris, of damaged tissue, and killing foreign microbes or viruses. So inflammation has a positive effect. Where inflammation has a problem is if it's sustained too long. So it should be just out there to do its job, attack the offender, and then it should be turned off. Well, the turn-off signals, which were not understood, are what Dr. Sirhan discovered, SPMs, specialized pro-resolving mediators. They resolve the inflammation signal. So the first signal is to turn on inflammation, and the second signal are SPMs to turn off the inflammation. And so this regulation of immune system balance and inflammation turns out that it's very important wherever the immune system has an important role. So you start saying, well, where would that be in the body? So obviously it's going to be in the blood, we know that, but it's going to be in certain tissues that have a lot of immune function importance, like in our intestinal tract, like in our brain, like in our pancreas, it produces insulin, like even in muscles where inflammatory conditions can create muscle injury. So when you start examining then where you find the highest levels of the production of these SPMs in humans, It's in those tissues where you have this immune inflammatory process being
So the
balanced.
body is producing these SPMs naturally in different
That's right.
parts. And then by taking this amazing omega-3 Alaskan oil, you actually found the SPMs within it.
Yes.
And then that, when we consume it, we get the benefits as if our
Yes.
body were making it. I'm
Yes.
just trying to like put this all together. It's incredible.
Well, you've put it together beautifully, because people have asked, well, you found these SPMs in this
Right.
oil, but how do we know that they have any effect if they would be consumed orally on the human? Then we go to a very interesting story of mother's breast milk. Mother's breast milk has a high level of these SPMs.
Oh.
In fact, the SPM portfolio, the orchestration of these SPMs in breast milk, is very comparable to the SPMs in this oil from the fish that we found in
Wow.
Alaska. Now you ask, again, coming back to structure function,
Right.
is this just a coincidence? And we don't believe it's a coincidence. We believe that mother's breast milk contains these SPMs for a specific reason for the development of the infant. Remember, that infant
Right.
has an immature immune system. They're going to depend upon certain support from the mother's colostrum and the immune factors to regulate the production of their immune system and their nervous system, which is dependent upon their immune system as well. These SPMs are in breast milk specifically for the function of developing the immune system and the nervous system of the infant. Then you say, well, do we know that they get absorbed? Yes, they do. The mother's breast milk is
Right.
influencing the blood levels of these SPMs in the infant. So I don't believe that it is a coincidence that we're seeing a same portfolio of these SPMs in this oil, because in the fish, what is the major immune organ? It is the liver. To defend against all the types of stress and trauma that the fish that's sitting down there at the bottom of the ocean is trying to keep away from predators and being injured and damaged, that liver produces its own immune function, which is seen in these SPMs. So we feel that by the way we process this oil to retain all these materials,
This
that we're
flash frozen process.
Exactly.
Right.
That we're the first group to be able to find these things in that particular
It's incredible.
oil.
So, Dr. Bland, you have really truly led the medical and nutritional worlds together to create a holistic understanding of really how we create healthcare versus sort of the sick care. And when I think about your body of work and the hundreds of thousands of medical professionals that you have taught and educated, so that people like me and everybody else that's watching this can actually be a weller being, right? We're not just well beings, but we can be weller in so many ways. I have heard time and time again, in fact, even today I heard it, fat clogs our arteries,
Yeah.
and we need to stay away from it. And yet you're telling us a completely different story here.
Yeah, I think that this is, again, coming back to how we differentiate fat, carbohydrate, and protein. We have to look within each of those families to understand the unique characteristics, not just at the generic concept of fat, but what fat.
Right.
And what we see is that there are certain cardiac risk factors associated with long chain, what are called saturated fats.
Right.
Now, these are the ones that obviously solidify on your kitchen sink. Or,
Like which ones? Give us a couple
well,
of
it'd be
examples.
like stearic acid.
Okay, and what is that?
Stearic acid would be a carbon-linked chain of about 18 carbons that would basically be considered the primary constituent of a lot of animal fat, right?
So like found in beef or
Yes.
okay, got it.
And that fat, we know in cooking, is the fat that would make up lard, or it would tend to solidify on the kitchen sink if it
Got it.
was heated and then it cooled. The other kinds of fat are these unsaturated fats, which can still be 18 carbons long, but they have a slightly modified composition relative to what's called unsaturation. I won't get into the chemistry, but that then makes those fats less solid. They become more liquid, and so they have a lower melting temperature. And those fats, they have a very different principle in how they're metabolized than these long-chain saturated fats. And so we cannot say that what goes on with saturated fats goes on with unsaturated fats. Then within the unsaturated fat families, we have several different subfamilies. So that would be what we call the omega-3, the omega-6, and the omega-9s. The omega-9s are high in olive oil, so that's
Right.
oleic acid, and that has its own unique health characteristic. The omega-6s would be like in corn oil or other vegetable oils. And then the omega-3s that we find like cold weather vegetable oils like flaxseed oil, canola oil, or in the more chain elongated forms of which we call the omega-3 oils like EPA and DHA, which you only find in marine fish or in algae. So each one of those families of oils has a different impact upon cellular function and health. And what we really have done is to put those all together saying, well, fat is bad, because we were eating so much saturated fat, we just assumed that all fats were of the same characteristic. Then as we started studying groups like the Greenland Eskimo, we said, no, hold it, what's wrong here? These people are eating all this fat, but they're not having these problems.
And lots of saturated fat, right?
And it's very interesting. When the Greenland Eskimo indigenous individual moves to Canada, Eastern Canada, they're close, and starts eating the Canadian diet, they have the same heart disease incidence as their Canadian neighbors.
Oh, wow.
So people used to say, oh, they're just protected because they have the genes that protect them. But no, it's not.
No.
They're eating a unique kind of fat that defends them against these concepts of heart disease. So there's a whole different function that they have in their body.
But they're eating like the blubber and the seals and all of that, and that's saturated as well as unsaturated?
It's mostly unsaturated. It's mostly the omega-3. There's very low levels of these long-chain saturated fatty acids. So it's really changing the disposition of how the oils are delivered to the body through the marine oils, which is, by the way, exactly what we see in our cod oil in Dutch Harbor, is that we have the ratio of 25% of the EPA and DHA omega-3s, and we have some, I think it's 25% of the omega-9s, and then we have some unique shorter and middle chain fatty acids, all of which work together as an orchestra to produce the health benefits.
So we all need these omega-3s on a daily basis, and when we get the right composition of the 3s, 6s, and 9s, what does it do to our arteries, and what's the overall thought process and the research showing us?
Yeah, so to try to keep this kind of in a simple but a complicated story.
Which you're so good at doing.
I don't know, we'll see. These oils are not used by the body directly. They get metabolized and converted into other things, like SPMs, if you have the right starting materials. And the starting materials for SPMs are DHA and EPA and arachidonic acid. So those three fatty acid members of the whole fat family are those that are used by the body, the immune system of our body, to make these SPMs. So if you didn't have those at all in your diet, let's say you constructed a chemical diet that didn't have those in, you wouldn't be able to make these SPMs, and that would influence adversely your ability to stop inflammation. If, however, you have the right balance of these oils, then your body can regulate these processes because they come downstream from the consumption of those materials. If you don't consume them, you don't have the raw materials to make these things that are going to regulate your immune system. So if you eat the right balance of these oils, then your body has the ingredients that it needs to make the final products that are going to regulate your immune system, like these SPMs. So if you eat wrong with regard to the oils, then you don't have the ability to regulate, as you would need, your immune response to an infection or an injury. So I think that what this really is reminding us is that the composition of these fats and how they play a role in our diet in influencing our health is as important as the percentage of fats that we get in our diet. Everyone's concerned about it. What is my percent of fats in my diet? But let me just say, the effects of the different oils trump by far the actual percentage of the fat in your diet in terms of controlling our health.
Incredible. So over the course of your 35-plus year career, you've interacted quite a bit with the nutritional supplement industry. And what are your observations, and what would you want to share with us on that?
Well, thank you. I think, first of all, I'm very proud of that relationship that I've had over probably the last 35 years with the dietary supplement industry. And I think there are some extraordinarily responsible players in this field that are really part of this health transformative process. I think one of the things that I'd observed early, and this would be back in the 1970s, was that There was just an emerging science around dietary supplements that could be leveraged in producing high-quality information for the consumer and also helping to guide standards for the development of high-quality supplements that would meet the rigors of testing and compliance and dating and all those things. I was very pleased to see that the FDA, after going through a little bit of fits and starts in the 70s and 80s, ultimately arrived at the point that it said, okay, if you as an industry can come up with some thoughts about how you're going to regulate standards, we might be on side. And of course that led into the early 90s with the discussion among the industry and Congress, which ultimately led into the passage of the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act. Then set up a series of meetings. I think we had over 50 what I would call forward-looking companies in the dietary supplement industry that met actually every week to develop a manifesto. This was the National Natural Products Quality Assurance Alliance, is what we called ourselves. And we then put together this document. Ended up being about 350 pages that described quality assurance standards for production of nutritional supplements that we then delivered to Congress, and it was then read into the congressional record by Senator Hatch. We're told that that was a very important document that showed that the industry was, at least the enlightened members of the industry, were going to step up and really be involved with producing high-quality products. I'm very pleased that over the years that's been kind of a watchword for the enlightened companies. And so I believe that the industry is really providing a service not only through its products but through its information, and really trying to get people to understand the role that nutrients play in modulating human function, and how that ultimately is seen with regard to changes in dietary patterns and changes of agricultural patterns and food processing, and some of the gaps that we have in nutrient intake between what is desired for optimal performance and that which we accept as adequate. And, and I think we're all really trying to aspire to have optimal health, not just get over the line.
It's such a confusing jungle of information out there, and I can't tell you how many people will say to me all the time, I thought vitamins weren't regulated. And what you're saying is something that's very different. And for anyone who wants to be taking the omega-3s, who wants to take vitamins every day, what would your comment, what would your recommendation be? And I'm assuming you take your vitamins every day, and why is that? Because I just think it's such a confusing amount of information.
Well, I think there's two levels. Number one is, what level of insurance do I need to kind of ensure that I've got my basic nutrition needs covered? And I call this kind of like a living life insurance program. You know, if you think of what life insurance is today, it's pretty much death insurance, right? It's paying our beneficiaries for our demise. A living life insurance program is doing something you invest in every day, which I think is to make sure you've got the standard good nutrition, and that's why for me, kind of a multivitamin, mineral, well balanced, along with fish oils and maybe a probiotic is a good place kind of to start. That would be my kind of general recipe. Then beyond that, you say, well, is there anything unique to me and my genetic uniqueness that is really required to be at my optimal performance? And I think we all, if we read our bodies, might know certain things about ourselves that say, I would be benefiting from a higher level of certain things. And therefore, I'm going to go beyond just the adequacy of my assurance policy to move to optimal performance. And I think there is where the authenticity of the dietary supplement industry really lies, and why people who are high performance individuals are looking at their bodies to say, this is a real temple and I want to treat it with the respect it deserves.
It's fascinating also when you look at where we live in the world and what kind of foods we want to consume most of the time. So for me, because of my inflammation issues that I have with the eczema, I always gravitate toward a higher fat diet. But when I'm consuming 50+% of my caloric intake as good fats, then I have to also sort of look at, personally for me, what minerals am I maybe not getting as much of, or the electrolytes that I need to make sure that I'm getting. So I think depending on the diets that we choose for our body type also sort of influences what nutrients we need, in addition to the three that you were mentioning.
That's so insightful what you just said. I think that is 100% correct. You know, there is no one diet that fits everybody correctly. We are much more different from person to person than we've recognized until recently. That's one of the advantages of this Human Genome Project, is we've learned that there are over 3 million single nucleotide polymorphisms that differentiate one person from another. We call them SNPs, right?
Right.
And so there's a lot more genetic diversity in our makeup than we previously understood. So I think if you recognize that there are certain uniquenesses that we each have, and the diet that's best for us might require certain nutrient specificity, then it gets us into personalized health, not just health for the average. In fact, Roger Williams, who was one of my great mentors for many years and was the discoverer of pantothenic acid, one of the B vitamins, he said a very powerful thing. He says, nutrition is for real people. Statistical humans are of little interest. However, if we think about the way we have suggested how nutrition is to be used, it's for statistical humans, like the back of cereal boxes. So I think we're into a whole new era of personalization.
It's remarkable. Dr. Bland, thank you so much for sharing so many of your incredible insights, your knowledge, what you've learned from your mentors and guides throughout the past 40 years of your career. And I can't wait to learn more from you over the next 40 years. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a privilege.
They see that's information that a lot of people didn't know, because everybody thinks that official is official is official, but
you're right, Montel. It's not information that we would even guess, right? Learning about the nuances of something that so many of us put into our body every day is what can take us from somewhat healthy to really transforming our health.
Wow, that's great. I mean, I'm so excited that you were able to get an interview with this next guest. That's Udo Erasmus. Now, tell us a little bit about him.
So Dr. Erasmus is one of my personal heroes. He transformed my life over 25 years ago through the incredible research that he has done around omega-3s, omega-6s, and omega-9s.
Wow, and those are things that most of us have never heard of. Take a look at this.
Dr. Udo Erasmus, I am honored and so excited to have you here today. I've waited for 22 years to be able to sit across the table from you and really have the opportunity to share what has transformed my life with so many millions of others. So just as a side note, I travel all the time with your oil that you created probably 30 years ago, and it's truly transformed my life. I'd love to know a little bit about you for the audience so that we can all start on the same page.
I'm best known for developing a method for making oils with health in mind, because they're very, very sensitive and they're easily damaged, and then they lose their health benefits. And I've written several books, and I'm very interested in nature and human nature. That's really is my topic it's a broad topic. I've been thinking about it since I was a 2-year-old in a war, that there must be a way that people can live together in a good way. So that's what I've been pursuing all my life.
Tell me a little bit about the book that really brought your name out into the world of nutrition and allowed you to become the authority on the essential fatty acids.
The book is called Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill. And it came out of doing research after I got poisoned by pesticides, and the doctors couldn't help me. So I had background in biochemistry and genetics and sciences. And I was reading through the journals and realized how much damage is done to oils when they're made for shelf life, because they're our most sensitive nutrients. They need the most care, and we give them the least care. We throw them in the frying pan. We don't do that with any, and because of that, they're damaged more than any other nutrients that we have, and more health problems come from damaged oils than any other source, and more health benefits would come if we made them with health in mind. So I got this idea in my head, oh my God, we could help so many people if we could make the oils with health in mind, because everybody uses them. And then omega-3s were established as essential the year after I started thinking about it. And I said, oh God, we could help so many people, because omega-3s are too low in 99% of the population, even for all of the attention they've gotten. So out of doing that research in the literature came the book Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill. And the title is about if you want to understand how fats affect health, you got to begin by understanding there are two completely opposite stories. And you got to tell them both, and then you got to figure out which is which, and then you get the ones that heal and you avoid the ones that kill.
So when you experienced pesticide poisoning, can you tell me a little bit about how that happened, when it happened, and the process that you used to eliminate the pesticides from your body?
Well, I got married and my marriage broke up, and I was really upset, and I wanted to kill something. And I took a job as a pesticide sprayer. You get to kill stuff. And I did it really carelessly for 3 years. I walked barefoot through the lawns I sprayed, and I was really careless. And 3 years later, the predictable outcome was I got poisoned by the pesticides I sprayed. And the doctors couldn't help me. They have nothing for pesticide poisoning. So I realized that day, oh, my health is my responsibility, and if I don't care about it, maybe nobody does. And then because I had the background, I started to look for how can I help myself. And I read a lot of research. I was in the library. This was before internet, right? I was in the library all the time reading the journals, and it was a big area, 600,000 studies on fats and their effects on health. And I didn't read all 600,000, but I read all the most important ones. And that's how it started. And then out of that came making oils with health in mind. And then flaxseed oil was the first oil we developed by that method because it's the most sensitive of the oils and it's the highest in omega-3s. And then I became omega-6 deficient on flax oil because it has a lot of omega-3 but not enough omega-6. Both are essential nutrients. So I decided to make a blend that was better balanced and where you couldn't get a problem from something I was making to try and help people get healthy.
So the literature tells us that we're not getting enough omega-3s in our diet and we may be getting too much of the other omegas. Can you tell me a little bit about why that is and what we can do to transform that?
First of all, omega-3 and omega-6 are essential nutrients, and that has a very specific definition. You can't make them in your body from anything else. You have to have them to live and be healthy. Therefore, they have to come in from outside. Omega-3 and 6 are equally essential. They're different, but equally essential. If you don't get enough, your health goes down. You get deficiency symptoms. They are degenerative in nature. They get worse with time. If you don't get enough long enough of any essential nutrient, you die. This is like the really important stuff when it comes to food. Third, if you're going down because you're not getting enough of an essential nutrient, but before you die, you bring enough of it back into your diet, all of the problems that come from not getting enough are reversed, because life knows exactly how to make a body that works, provided we take responsibility to make sure that all of the essential nutrients land in our body in optimum quantities so life can do its job with them. And so that's what essential means. Omega-3 and 6 are equally essential. We have lowered our omega-3 intake way down. It's 99%. It's this single biggest essential nutrient deficiency of our time. We've raised our omega-6s, but the problem isn't that omega-6s are bad. The problem is that the processing that is used to make our cooking oils, it's basically we treat the oils with Drano, with window washing acid, then with bleach, and then we heat them to frying temperature to clean up the mess that we made. And then we end up with an oil that has 0.5 to 1% damaged molecules. And in a tablespoon of oil that is 1% damaged, you get more than 6 million damaged molecules for every one of your body's 10 trillion cells. And these are things that never existed in nature. They interfere with health, and that's why so many problems come from these damaged oils. So the problem with the omega-6 is we get enough. We get maybe more than we need, but the problem that they cause should be blamed on the processing, not on the omega-6s themselves, because they're essential. In fact, when I was doing my work, I was reading research. It said omega-6s are essential. That was clear. That's been clear since 1930. 29, 30. And then omega-6s give you cancer and kill you. And I said, well, how can that be? It's essential for health and then it kills you? And trying to figure out that contradiction is what got me focused on how they're processed. And then I realized, oh yeah, there's where the problem comes. It's not from the omega-6s, it's from the processing and from the imbalance between omega-3s and 6s. So we fixed two things. One is to make them with health in mind so they're not damaged. The other one is bring the omega-3s up to levels where they're in the right ratio to one another.
For so many people, your book was the first exposure to omega-3s. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened after the world started to learn about these incredible essential fatty acids? And tell us a bit about your oil.
Oh, well, I got really excited because we could help so many people, and we were on fire. We were broke. You know, we didn't have money. I had been poisoned. I didn't have a job. I was a gardener beforehand. I used to do carpentry and paint houses and build houses and I had all the background, but that's where I ended up. And we were so excited that we could help so many people. We did a tour through the US. We went to 85 cities in 101 days, 35 states, 17,000 miles by road in a van without air conditioning in July, August, half September, half of June. Talked to anybody who would listen to us. And we were really on fire. And I slept on the floor between the steering wheel and the back. We had our clothes on a broomstick inside the double doors. My driver had built himself a bunk across the back, and that's how we toured for those 101 days. And within 2 years, flax oil was the second best selling oil in the health food trade, because we were working in the natural foods trade because they were open to new things. The big industry was not that open to it. So that's the story.
Let's talk about fats in general. There's a pervasive belief in the general public that fats are bad.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
Can I say it plain? It's bullshit. Bad fats are bad and good fats are good. So to say fats are bad, you're missing half the story. You actually, if somebody says fats are bad, they don't actually know the field. Fats are not bad. Bad fats are bad. If they're damaged, they're bad. If you get too much of the wrong kind, they're bad. The really good ones are the essential ones. It's the only thing from fats you have to be healthy and to live. Omega-3 and omega-6. Your body can make everything else. Even the fish oils. You were talking about food foundation. Even the fish oils are supplements the body can make if you get enough omega-3s in your diet, plant-based.
Would you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, fish oil, you know, when we talk omega-3s, mostly people are always thinking, oh yeah, fish oil. Because the fish oil industry is much older than what we've been doing is, and they have a big presence, and it's made out of waste materials, so it's cheaper. And as soon as we started talking about the plant-based omega-3s, which are the essential fatty acids, the fish oil said the body cannot convert plant omega-3s into fish oil, but it can. It already could when they started, but they started that argument the week we came out with flax oil. And so alpha-linolenic acid is the omega-3 fatty acid. The body can make EPA and DHA, which is what the fish oil contains. The fish oil is a supplement. We're talking about the foundation. We're talking about getting clean bottled oils to use in foods, not to fry with, but to use in foods. Go back to water for cooking, because frying is the worst thing we ever invented to do to our foods. Fried oils fry health. Fried foods fry health. And every time you put oil in your frying pan, you'll remember this one from now on. Fried foods fry health. Fried oil fry health. Because you're changing molecules from something natural that life gave you a genetic program to work with, that it knows how to break down and change and do things with, into molecules that never existed in nature. And because they never existed in nature, life never made a genetic program to break them down. And so then they accumulate in the body. Then you get inflammation, because that's the body's way of trying to slow things down, to try and figure out what to do. And it has nothing to figure out what to do, so you get chronic inflammation. This is not only true for fats that are damaged, but it's also for molecules that are processed in other ways that are damaged. And then they end up in the body, and they interfere with what needs to be going on. They block processes, and that's where they're degenerative symptoms. That's how the degenerative symptoms are caused.
So do you believe that there are any good cooking oils?
Yes, water. That's what people always say. Oh, but what if I have to fry? You don't have to fry, right? If you want to fry, the hardest fats are less toxic than the liquid oils because they're more sensitive molecules. But you still, if you turn the food brown, you're burning the food and you're burning the oil. So what we did 100 years ago, or like 120 years ago, there was no big oil industry. What did we do? We cooked in water, or they used lard, butter for frying when they did, but mostly we cooked in water. And then people say, well, what do you mean? You want me to boil my steak? My answer is, yeah, that's exactly what I want you to do. We used to cut it in cubes, throw it in the stew with the vegetables and the spices. Tasted great. Wasn't burnt. Didn't hurt us. So water for cooking, if you're going to cook. And remember, just to put it in context, life's mandate for every creature on the planet, for as long as there have been creatures here, 4 billion years or however long it is, fresh, whole, raw, organic. So even if you cook in water, you're already taking it down from that state.
So that's very interesting. You're telling me that 120 years ago, people were literally not frying in cooking oils. Can you tell me a bit about the history and how these oils have been incorporated into our lives and the evolution of the cooking oil industry?
Yeah, there was in the 1800s and before that, people did have oils. They used them in food. An example, extra virgin olive oil, which is not made by the screw presses, but is floated off on water. It's a different process because it comes from the flesh of the olive. And they used that. They didn't use that for cooking. They cooked their vegetables in water. They poured off the water. Then they put on oil for flavor. That's how basically people used oils. In Europe, there were people made flax oil. They called it linseed oil at the time, but it was called we called it flaxseed oil because we wanted to make a distinction between food grade oil that's good for you and oil that's used to paint furniture that comes from the same plant. And that's wrecked and it's damaged and it smells really bad. So they sold flaxseed oil, but they didn't have refrigeration. So they made it fresh every week because it spoils quite rapidly. Oxygen, heat, and light damage the omega-3s especially very rapidly. And so they would go with a cart in the village and they would drop off the bottles and pick up the old bottles, wash them and fill them up again. So that was called cold hammered oil. So it was a German thing. Kalt geschlagen was the word. Then the big oil industries started thinking about it, about making oils. And they developed screw presses where you squeeze the seeds into a tight space and you have a screw that turns and the oil gets squeezed out under enormous pressure. And then they wanted to make it sound like this was as good as the old cold hammered oil, so they called it cold pressed. Cold pressed never had a definition. It was a meaningless term that was used to imply that the oil was as good. The problem with those oil was they had huge factories, they wanted big markets, they needed a long shelf life. And the need for the long shelf life, this was not a health consideration. The need for a long shelf life resulted in them figuring out that if they treated with sodium hydroxide, which is called Drano, right? And then very corrosive base, then with a very corrosive acid, phosphoric acid, it's used for window washing. Then they bleach it with bleaching clays. Then it goes rancid and smells bad, so they have to deodorize it. And to do that, they have to boil the oil because they're boiling off the damaged molecules. And then they get a colorless, odorless, tasteless oil. You can't tell what seed it came from because all of the flavor molecules are gone. And you have a so-called cooking and salad oil. And then the issue became, oh my God, they use oil for cooking. They use water for cooking. If we could get them to use oil for cooking, can you imagine how much oil we could sell? And so then they started advertising to my parents' generation in the 30s and 40s, 50s, 60s, how it was much better and much more time effective and much more convenient just to pour oil in the frying pan and then throw the stuff in and fry your foods. And then basically our mothers bought it. In those days, people used to say things like, oh, you know, the industry would never tell us to do anything that's bad for us. You know, now when you hear it, you laugh because so much exposure of crazy stuff that's done for money instead of for health or, you know, or for profit rather than the consumer's benefit. So much we've heard, now we don't believe it anymore, but in those days they believed it. So our parents adopted the habit. We learned the habit with mother love. And I tell people that they should separate the mother love, which is a really good thing, from the bad habit that an industry bamboozled our mothers into for the sake of making more money. Because that process that she learned to do and that we learned from her is actually very damaging to health. In fact, more health problems come from damaged oils than any other part of nutrition.
Another doctor, Dr. Kate Shanahan, that we've spoken with, stated that if she had the choice for her patients to either quit bad oils or quit smoking, if given the choice, what would she recommend? And she said to quit bad cooking oils. Can you give us your perspective on it? I
agree. There's more health problems come from bad oils than any other part of nutrition. I would say carbohydrates come second, because if you eat too much, you get overweight, you get blood sugar swings, you get cravings, you get insulin swings, they shorten your life. If you get overweight enough, you get diabetes. Most diabetes die of cardiovascular disease, so it's a big deal. And I would put smoking third. But, you know, we are best off not by just making one of those three choices, we should quit them all.
I'd like to talk a little bit about sugar now and how the food industry has really replaced the fat that we were ingesting with sugar. And what are the effects that we have experienced because of this?
Well, I think the demonization of fats came with the McGovern report in 1979. It was called the McGovern Report on Nutrition and Health. And in that report, they said we should eat more carbohydrates and we should eat less oils. They didn't focus on the processing damage of the oils. They should have, but they didn't. They just demonized the oils. So eat less oils, eat more carbs. You know, and people were eating less fat and they were getting fatter. And they were still saying fat makes you fat. And there's a simplicity to it, right? Eat fat, get fat. Happens to not be how the body works. Because when you eat fat, even though they have more calories than carbs, what happens is they suppress appetite. You don't end up overeating. You get stable energy. You don't get the blood sugar swings. You don't get the mood swings. You don't get the insulin swings. You don't get the cravings. And with the carbs, if you eat more than you burn, and the less physically active are, the less you can burn before you get too much. Your blood sugar goes up. That's toxic. Insulin drives the sugar into your cells. In the cells, they turn on a gene called fatty acid synthase that turns sugars into fats. And then when the body's very efficient at doing that, by the time it's done, you've got low blood sugar, and now you got to eat. Your body screams at you, eat or die. And so you're going to eat. You usually eat carbs because you've been told fats are bad. So you eat the carbs. They have to be digested. It takes time to do that. And by the time your blood sugar is normal, you've eaten more carbs than you needed, and you've just started the next round of the carb addiction cycle, which has been measured as being 8 times more powerful than our addiction to cocaine. And that makes sense. It's a survival thing, right? When your blood sugar goes down and you have no fuel, you die, right? You gotta have fuel. So the carbs turn off fat burning in the body. There are genes involved in that. And they turn on the gene for fat production. The fats don't do that. They don't turn off the fat burning genes, and they don't turn on the fat production genes. And the omega-3s that are too low in almost everybody's diet actually actively turn on fat burning in the body and turn off fat production, provided that when you bring in the good oils, you also lower your carbs at the same time. And that's how you end up with a ketogenic diet. Because if you keep your carbs high and then add oils, your body will prefer the carbs and burn them first. And you're still going to go through the swings and you're still going to put on weight.
Dr. Erasmus, can you elaborate on that a little bit more and how omega-3s you mentioned can affect weight loss? What are some of the mechanisms of action with that?
Yes, omega-3s assist in weight loss. And we found that out by accident because we just knew omega-3s were essential. There wasn't a lot of research when we started. We got people their omega-3s back, and people would write to us and talk to us and say, I took the oil and I lost some weight. So I thought, oh, how cool is that? So then I started telling people that it's a good way to lose weight. And then I got some feedback from some people who said, well, I did what you said, but I actually gained a little weight. So then I asked them, well, what did you do? They were people who added the oil to all the carbs they were already eating. And the research is now clear that when you eat carbs, your body will burn the carbs first, because if it doesn't burn them, they become toxic. Right? And so we then started to tell those people, well, when you bring in the good oils, at the same time, you need to lower your carb intake. And in fact, I recommend that you get your carbohydrates from green vegetables, but not the starchy vegetables, not the potatoes, the pasta, the fries, the cookies, the cake, the flour, the grains, right? You get your carbs from vegetables because it's okay to have some carbs. They're just too concentrated for the amount of activity that we have. And if you're an athlete, you can burn quite a few carbs and you get away with a lot more carbs, simply because you have bigger muscles and you do more activity, and muscles burn carbs faster than fat tissue does, right? And so what we said, you need to do a fuel shift, not a fuel addition. A fuel shift off the carbs onto the good oils that have omega-3 and 6. Not only are they better fuel, but they also have 2 essential nutrients, which, by the way, there are no essential carbohydrates, right? That tells you that carbohydrates are actually the least important food, not the most important food. Now, there's nutrients in the carbohydrates, but there's nothing in carbohydrates you can't get elsewhere.
So the public, we understand that trans fats are bad. I was speaking to my mother on the phone this morning, and we were talking about how margarine is a perfect example of that. Can you help us to understand some of the other fats that are bad in our diets? Well, the first unhealthy fats are the ones that we damage in the frying pan and that the industry damages them in the process of making them. The second one is the trans fats. The trans fats were used to make liquid oils hard, so called hardening. And so they made a cheap substitute for butter called margarine, and did that by treating the oils with hydrogen. They bubbled hydrogen through it with nickel and like as a catalyst. And then what happens is, first the oils molecules are like bent, and they don't stack together very well, so they don't crystallize, which is why they're liquid at low temperatures. When you twist them around the double bonds that they have, you end up with a straight molecule. Now they stack together, so you get something that hardens at room temperature. That's why they used it to make margarines. But when you twist those molecules, you're turning it into something that never existed in nature. And Harvard School of Public Health, when they busted the trans fatty acids in the 90s, they basically said they double risk of heart attack, they increase risk of stroke, they increase risk of cancer, they're bad for diabetics, they kill at least 30,000 Americans every year. They interfere with fertility in male and female animals. We never did those studies in people. And basically, we need to get them out of our diet. And they were patented in, the method for making them was patented in 1901. And Procter & Gamble introduced the first margarine containing trans fatty acids in 1911. They didn't have to be listed on the labels. The only way you knew there were trans fatty acids in it if you added polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated fats, and they didn't add up to 100, then the remainder would be
trans fats. But nobody knew that, and nobody got told that. And people were told margarines are better than butter. And a lot of people bought that, and it was a completely stupid idea. Another one of those ideas from the industry that would never do anything that could hurt you.
I know about linolenic acid, but tell us a little bit about the components and then the different effects.
Linoleic acid is the omega-6 essential fatty acid. That was established as essential in 1929-30 by Burr and Burr. And alpha-linolenic acid is the essential omega-3 from plants, and that was not established as essential until 1981. So that was the year after I got poisoned, so my timing could not have been better for getting poisoned to be doing what I'm doing. What do? They're required by every cell in the body, and they are changed in the body by enzymes on our genes into other derivatives, including EPA in the fish oil. And from some of those derivatives, the body makes hormones that regulate cell activity on a moment-to-moment basis. Those are called eicosanoids, or prostaglandins, prostacyclins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. You know, this is all like chemistry stuff, right? But they have super important functions, and both of them make derivatives. And then from some of those derivatives, the body makes very powerful antioxidants called protectants, very powerful anti-inflammatories called resolvents because they resolve inflammation, maricins, which are very important for immune function, and the most recent one that was discovered is they make endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids are feel-good molecules. People get those feel-good molecules by smoking weed, because it's called cannabis. There are cannabinoid receptors in the brain, and when they go to the brain, then you get high. But actually, your body makes those same molecules, not the same molecules, but similar molecules that occupy those sites and that elevate mood and lift depression from omega-3s. So there's many, many things. And this is still a field that isn't fully developed because there are so many different things that these oils can be turned into. Plus, when they react with amino acids, a whole other set of different molecules gets formed. Plus, they might even be able to react with carbohydrates and form still another set of molecules. It's a very, very complicated field that we're in the middle of. But the basics are clear. We have two essential fatty acids, linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid, omega-6 and omega-3. And if you optimize both of those and you get them in the right ratio and they're not damaged and you don't damage them in food preparation, then everything else that is made from them will unfold in your body, and you don't actually have to worry about it. Unless you want to isolate some of those derivatives and then make a drug out of them so that you can patent, and make obscene profits on.
Since you wrote your book in the 80s, can you share with us a little bit of the additional research that's developed in this field?
Actually, Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill was last updated in 1997. It was published in 1993. Came out in 94. What's happened? Not so much about the basics, but a lot more research has been done on omega-3s. And the research, if you want to sum it all up, if you increase omega-3s in your diet, provided they're not damaged and don't contain toxins, because that's a big issue, you can improve virtually every major degenerative condition of our time. That's the one-sentence summary of all the work that's been done. Because when we started in 1980, 86, we came out with flax oil, that research wasn't there. Very little research there. Second thing that's happened is the fish oils have been more processed over the years, and that's because they had to take the dioxins out, the PCBs and dioxins out, to lower the level. They're not safe at any level, but the government said 90 parts per billion is okay. Sometimes they were up to 1,300 parts per billion. So they had to take them out, but that takes more processing. And they wanted to make the stinky fish oil smell better, so they had to deodorize it. That takes place at frying temperature. And the result of that is that when they now look at the studies, the more recent studies, they're saying most of the things we said fish oils did, they don't do. So in cardiovascular disease, they're not helpful anymore. In cancer, they're not helpful. They should be, because EPA and DHA are incredibly good molecules and have important functions in the body, but not if they're damaged. And if you put poison into something good, then you're going to neutralize some of the effects. If you put enough poison, you're going to neutralize all the effects. And if you put even more poison in it, then something that's supposed to have benefits will actually poison you. And we've headed in that direction with the fish oils. So that's one thing that's happened. Second thing is people started saying, oh, the body can't convert. And then they said the body can't convert enough. And it's now been established that your brain only needs 2.4 to 3.8 milligrams of DHA per day. And you can get more than that from 1 gram of alpha-linolenic acid if it's converted just 0.5%. So again, the issue is if you optimize the essential fatty acids, the body will make the derivatives. You do not need fish oils. And they're so damaged. I mean, they're even more sensitive than the omega-3s and 6s. Omega-3 is 5 times more sensitive than omega-6, and EPA and DHA are 5 times more sensitive than alpha-linolenic acid. So they're super, super sensitive. And they go through similar process, other than they pull a vacuum so they can lower the temperature a little bit, but they go through the same process as the cooking oils do. But they're more damaged. They're not just 0.5 to 1%, but maybe 3 to 5, and maybe if they concentrate the fish oils to concentrate the omega-3s, the research says they also concentrate the damaged molecules. So I don't recommend fish oils. Krill oil, on the other hand, is made by a different process. And all of the environmental issues have been addressed before the first net went in the water. So if you're going to use a supplement, then use krill oil, because it's not damaged. And it's a better form, and you need less, and it's absorbed in a better way, and it has its own antioxidants. It's really a nice product. And it's low on the food chain, so it doesn't have the toxicity of the fish.
When we were speaking a little bit earlier, you spoke about some diseases of civilization. Help us to understand that a little more.
Yeah, if you look at the standard that life set for creatures, fresh, whole, raw, organic, and it was also in season, local, and sunrise seasonal, right? So if you look at that as the standard, the animals that eat like that, they don't get degenerative diseases. They don't get the diseases that we get. So people in the 1800s, 1900s called cardio and cancer and diabetes and obesity, they called them diseases of civilization, and arthritis and rheumatoid, all of those diseases. And they called them diseases of civilization because if you're not civilized, you don't get those diseases, right? So then you have to ask the question, well, what did we do? How did we change from nature in our civilization? Well, the biggest issue is we processed the foods. We started with fresh, whole, raw, organic foods the way nature makes them. The way our system was in that system is where our genetic program was created. And that program only works well if you stay in line with nature. So fresh, whole, raw, organic. So then what have we done? Well, we took the fresh, whole, raw, organic stuff. We threw pesticides on it. Pesticides kill living things. We are living things. They hurt us too. Not just insects. Chemistry is not different, that different. So we put pesticides on them, and then we wanted to give them longer shelf life, so we took out some of the minerals and some of the vitamins that are essential for our health, so we didn't get those. And then we put in preservatives that are artificial, so we're getting stuff in our body that wasn't meant to be in there because it never existed in nature. And then we processed them in other ways for shelf life, and we ended up with white sugar, white flour, white oils, white fats, margarine shortenings, and even, so we ended up with the whites that if people know nutrition at all, they're told no white sugar, no white flour, no white oils, no frying, no white fats, right? Why? Because we're getting something that cannot work for health. If you get out of line with nature, in your body, you cannot stay healthy. And what I tend to do is I always look at nature. How was it before we got civilized? And so I developed enzymes to bring back, because enzymes are destroyed when foods are cooked, so they should be replaced. Otherwise, you put a load on your digestive system it wasn't meant to handle, and it then wears down. Probiotics get killed. They're on raw foods when they're grown in nature, the natural way. Those get killed when you cook the foods. You should replace those. We eat a lot more animal foods than plant foods because there was a time when we had rocks to hunt with, and the hunters came home empty-handed most of the time, right? Because animals move. So then they would eat vegetables because they don't run away, they don't fight back, and they're really easy to hunt down and kill, right? And so they ate more vegetables, and we eat more meat now. Vegetables have a lot of fiber that keeps the digestive tract healthy. They also help with weight loss, just like good fats help with weight loss. Probiotics help with weight loss in certain kinds, probably because of inflammation, because weight is either too much fat or too much water, and the water comes from inflammation. You hold water, and literally you deal with the inflammation. You pee out your overweight because it's just water held in your tissues, because you're messing up with your immune system, because you're giving it things to do that it wasn't made to do. So the issue is that processing is where the focus should go when we look at why are we getting so many diseases of civilization in our civilized world. And then the steps we need to take is how do we live more in line with nature, given that we live in cities and given that we're living in a relatively unnatural situation. But we can always bring fresh, whole, raw organic foods in. Of course, the raw organic and the vegetarian, the plant-based diets, those movements are growing very well because people recognize you can't trust the industries. You can't trust nature because nature was the system that created life and supports life. And nature, or life, life doesn't look at you and say, okay, I think I'm going to give this guy cancer today. Life doesn't give you cancer. What gives you cancer is life is unable to do its job because you're depriving it of something it needs as building blocks, or you're putting in poisons that interfere with its work. And so the idea then is, you go from frying to cooking in water, you go from cooking in water to eating raw as much as you can, unless it's contaminated, in which case you need to kill the bugs. But what do you have to do to live in line with nature in a relatively artificial situation? And how do you get your ears turned off with all the fads and the diets and the advertising and all of the information that's put out by people who care a hoot about your health and care a lot about how much money they can make by faking you?
Dr. Erasmus, you've given a real physical perspective on health and fats. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I like the idea that 8 billion people can live fully present in all of their being. And that's, for me, that's the goal. And we're wired for it. We're just not looking into the wiring. We're looking out into the reactions, the stress stuff, the survival stuff. In here is something that is beyond survival. And this is not going to survive anyway. So we might as well see what we can do to thrive in the time that we have. That's a very different attitude between survival and thriving, right? And I would just say, spend time alone, shut up, get really quiet, get as quiet as you can, go as deep as you can, look around, feel what it feels like to be a human being alive, because you will like it. If you actually experience it, you will say, wow, I've always had it so good, no matter what you went through. And your awareness and your life were never affected by any of your dramas, any of your traumas, any of your circumstances. Not my war either, not my poisoning either, not my marriage breakup either. Your life is not affected. Your mind is affected, your emotions are affected, your body is affected. Something is not affected. When you can stay in that place in your life, you are going to have an incredibly beautiful, beautiful, beautiful life. And I wish that for 8 billion people. I know we only got 7.6 right now, but it's going to take a bit.
Thank you so much for making my dream come true and sharing with us all of your insights, the view that you have on the world, the research that you've done. I truly believe you have had a remarkable, remarkable impact on so many millions of people, and I am your biggest fan. Thank you.
All right.
What an inspirational man.
Right? And to think that over 30 years ago, he wrote the book Fats That Heal and Fats That Kill. How ahead of his time was he?
Wait, how come it took us 30 years to get to it?
Right?
Crazy. See, I really love this episode because, again, like we've done in all the ones before, we've got really solid guests with really solid information that everybody can use.
That's so true. And if you get just 1, 2, 3 points out of this information and share it, it can transform not just your health, but that of the people you love.
Well, I'm glad that so many of you at home have already proven that this is information that you can use, because so many of you have already clicked the button down below and you've made this series a part of your own home library. But remember, don't be greedy, pass it on. Hit the other button down there, pass this on to a friend. Make sure you share this information, because making other people's lives better will make yours better. Naomi, thank you so much for being here.
Montel, thank you.
We got another 2 to go.
That's right.
Make sure you join us tomorrow.
Every single organ system in the body is out of sync when we don't have our circadian rhythm working properly, and everything goes into some degree of malfunction. So it can affect virtually every single function in the body.
I think if people understood, they don't have to exercise a lot. That's the big secret, that big, you must exercise all the time. I go, really, I don't exercise that much. I can be on the road and I can do a 10-minute walk. And out of that 10 minute, I can have 4 major pushes in there. And that could be my entire workout for the day.
Let's say your body needs, we'll just pick a number, 7 hours, and you only get 6 hours for a consistent period of time. There's data to show that your body actually becomes insulin resistant within 36 to 48 hours.
Back 150 years ago, people weren't going to a gym because it didn't exist. They were getting their physical activity just to get through their day. We get so caught up in all these different types of exercises and fitness crazes, and the same thing with diets. And we need to come back to the basics. Sometimes we make things so much more complex than they need to be.